Enron, a name that is almost immediately associated with the words scandal and bankruptcy. That's because in 2001, Enron, with its $63 billion in assets, was the biggest bankruptcy of corporate America at that time. Because it was not just another bankruptcy, an unfortunate turn of events for a company that was simply doing its business and succumbed to the circumstances. Because it also brought down one of the big 5 accounting firms of that time, Arthur Andersen. Because a massive legislation was approved to avoid the excesses and the problems linked to Enron's bankruptcy, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. In fact, as soon as the ACC opened the lid of Enron Corporation, it was revealed to the world that the company was not what they were seeing. It was just a deception, a well-crafted image, a make-believe for investors, creditors, and clients. Enron was formed in 1985 from the merger between 2 relatively small regional natural gas companies, Internorth, based in Omaha, Nebraska, and Houston Natural Gas, based in Houston, Texas. The name was officially changed into Enron by the end of the same year, with the headquarters established in Houston a year later. In the first period of its life, to the late 1980s, the company was mainly focused on its core business, bringing gas from producer to utilities and extending its pipeline network. Company performance was good, but nothing remarkable. It was in the 1990s, though, that the company completely changed gear. In the period 1990 till 1998, its share price increased by 311%. In 1999, though, it went up by 56%, and a further 87% in 2000. At its peak, the share price reached $90 during the last quarter of 2000. The price-to-earnings ratio, a common indicator used, among other things, to gauge the company's future earnings growth potential, reached 55 in 2000. That's 2.5 times more than comparable competitors, and definitely something unheard of in a not-so-dynamic and exciting energy industry. During the same period, Fortune magazine named Enron America's most innovative company 6 years running, and reached number 7 in the list of the 500 biggest companies published in April 2001. If Enron's share price performance was staggering, its revenue growth then looks out of this world. Revenues went from $13 billion in 1996 to $101 billion in 2000. That's a 750% growth. Only in the last year, from 1999 to 2000, they jumped 150%, from $40 billion to $101 billion. Overall, that meant a 65% average growth from 1996 to 2000. That was unheard of, not only in the energy industry, but in any kind of industry. If it took Enron 16 years to reach those record-breaking numbers, it took them just about 2 months to fall. In October 2001, Enron announced its first quarterly loss in 4 years of $618 million. This was due to $1 billion write-offs related to non-performing investments made in the previous years. It also announced a $1.2 billion reduction in equity due to wrong accounting of some of its investments. Later, in November, they announced a restatement of their financial statements from 1997 to 2000, plus the first 2 quarters of 2001. That's to reflect the retroactive consolidation of certain investments that Enron previously reported as off-balance sheet entities. More on those later. In total, the earnings were reduced by $569 million. The consequences of these announcements were immediate and devastating for Enron. The share price that was already going down since summer 2001 quickly went to basically zero in a matter of a couple of weeks between October and November. The SEC immediately launched an investigation into the off-balance sheet transactions and entities. By the end of November, credit rating companies downgraded Enron long-term debt to junk status. At the same time, the company was negotiating a merger with a competitor, Dinergy, that would have saved the business, but the news about the restatements and the credit downgrade caused the merger to fall through. At that point, the banks triggered the various covenants and guarantees they had on Enron's debt to recover their money, but Enron didn't have that money. Given the situation, the only viable decision was made. On December 2, 2001, Enron filed for bankruptcy and sought protection under Chapter 11. on the same day, 4,000 employees, out of a total of almost 21,000, lost their jobs and were told they had 30 minutes to vacate the headquarters. The fall of the share price wiped out millions of dollars in investments, including the pension saving plans of its employees. Unsurprisingly, lawsuits and convictions followed. Who were the main characters in Enron's tragedy? There are actually various actors that over the years, with their actions, shaped Enron and its behaviors, or anyway helped creating the conditions for Enron's mighty fall. All things considered, we can identify three main characters that more than others played a pivotal role. Kenneth Lay served as CEO and chairman from 1985. A very ambitious man, he simply wanted Enron to be the greatest company of all time and bathe in the glory it would bestow him. Jeffrey Skilling, hired directly by Lay in 1990, he was CEO of Enron Capital and Trading, then promoted to Chief Operating Officer of Enron Corporation in 1997. He was the brain behind Enron's change of gear from 1990 onwards. Andrew Fastow, the CFO, hired in 1990 by Skilling, he was the man behind many creative accounting solutions and initiatives that ultimately brought the company down. One remarkable thing of Enron's story is that its fall was so sudden that it took everyone by surprise: investors, shareholders, analysts, employees themselves. But how did it happen? What caused the collapse? By reading the various articles and analyses made over the years, it's clear that there wasn't a single event or decision that caused the collapse. Substantially, from 1919 onwards, various seeds were planted, and it was just a matter of when, not if, everything would all come down. In this regard, I agree with the view outlined in the book The Smartest Guys in the Room, and I quote, "Enron is a story of human weakness, of hubris and greed, of ambition run amok, of a business model that didn't work, and of smart people that believed their next gamble would cover their last disaster." To understand how greed, ambition, etc. caused Enron's fall, let's have a look at Enron's business model first, and then the company culture. Then we can understand how they interacted and fed onto each other to create the perfect storm, so to speak. Enron, until the late 1980s, was mainly focused on supplying natural gas and expanding its pipeline network. It was working, but not making Enron the biggest company in the world, though. From mid-1980s, natural gas industry went through a series of deregulation phases, and the big one was to allow the price of gas to fluctuate based on demand and supply instead of being fixed by the authorities. This brought an increase in the overall gas supply, but it also introduced an extreme price volatility. Enron was adamant in exploiting this to its advantage. But it failed to do so until Jeffrey Skilling joined the company in 1990. His revolutionary idea was the gas bank. Enron, he thought, should function as an intermediary between producers and utilities for final consumers. Like a bank, Enron would gather gas deposits from producers, repackage them in standardized contracts, and then sell them to the consumers. To remove the price volatility, Enron would define fixed-price long-term agreements for both sides. The length could be 10, 15, 20 years. In this way, Enron was taking onto itself all the price volatility, though. So in order to offset it, they made extensive use of complex financial instruments that go under the name of derivatives contracts. The company basically set up a trading division that acted like Wall Street traders. The idea worked, and by 1992, Enron became the largest natural gas merchant in North America. Skilling's idea rested on two pillars that, as we will see, would be central to the company's problems. The first one was the possibility of booking the deals his division was signing using mark-to-market accounting, and the second was the use of special purpose entities, in short SPEs, to finance the expansion of the natural gas supplies. But what's mark-to-market and what are these SPEs? Let's have a look. With mark-to-market accounting, instead of booking each year as they emerge the revenues and costs related to a contract, Enron could recognize immediately the total of these revenues and costs. So the company could book immediately in year one all the 15 or 20 years worth of revenues and costs, with just the need to adjust those figures each year afterwards, only if there was a significant difference between the original estimate versus the actual values. No wonder why then Enron's revenues boomed Let's have a look at SPEs now. A key element of Enron's strategy was that in order to sell more contracts, they needed to expand their gas supplies, which meant financing producers to find and exploit new reservoirs. This required a lot of capital investment. The source of capital can come either from equity, so issuing more shares, or taking in more long-term debt. Enron on one side did not want to issue new stock to avoid diluting the earnings per share of the current shareholders. And on the other side, they could not increase their long-term debt if they wanted to keep their credit rating in the investment-worthy category. The solution was to use special purpose entities. It was a common practice at the time, and it's not illegal. Of course, Enron, being Enron, managed to abuse of this instrument, and it became the reason why they were forced to restate the financial statements in November 2001. So an SPE is simply an entity set up by a company to fulfill a specific need. In case of Enron, the initial purpose was to raise capital from investors to finance natural gas exploitation. Later though, their use was extended in various directions and allowed the company to conceal debt, losses, and recognize fictitious revenues. The crucial part is that when an SPE is formed, if at least 3% of its equity is coming from an independent investor, and if this investor has control of the entity and they can lose all their money, then it can be considered as an independent company, and there is no need to consolidate into the balance sheet of the forming company. So in short, Enron did not need to show in its balance sheet the debt of these entities. They were all in all invisible and allowed the company to keep its healthy financial image. Finally, two further elements were part of Enron's business model: international expansion and diversification to other segments. Given the success in natural gas, in fact, the company wanted to replicate the bank model into electric power, water, and even broadband. At the same time, they wanted to expand internationally as well. The first project was an electric power plant in Teesside, UK in 1993. It was a success, so they quickly moved on to other markets: Eastern Europe, Africa, India, China, Central and South America. To put it simply, in Enron there was an established culture of greed, personal ambition and sense of entitlement. Especially under skilling, behaviors that in other companies could cost an employee their job were easily forgiven if the person was a winner, someone that made the deal happen and ultimately brought in the revenues. The employee evaluation system itself, in fact, classified employees based on their ability to generate revenues. If someone ranked in the lowest tier, the fifth, they had 6 months to improve or they were out of the company. This fostered a cutthroat culture where various divisions and employees were competing between one another to increase their revenues, and some of them were not shy in resorting to dirty tricks as well. At the same time, directors, executives, and high-performing employees were all showered with fat contracts, bonuses, and benefits, the most important one being stock options. The sense of entitlement was coming from the very top. Lay, the CEO, was not shy in indulging in company luxuries, especially the corporate jets that were also used by his family as they pleased. Lavish parties, company outings for executives were the norm, and their excesses entered the company mythology. Not to mention the expensive events held for investors or potential investors, banks, share analysts, etc. In the end, this winner-takes-all mentality, where greed is good, brought all the excesses that contributed to Enron's fall, as it justified various actors to find more and clever ways to push the boundaries of business and accounting practices to achieve the company's stated financial and economic objectives, and as a consequence, earn their bonuses. But in some cases, as we will see, this mentality also pushed employees to outright defraud the company itself. So how did the business model and the company culture combine to create the perfect storm? Let's take the market-to-market accounting. As we saw, it allowed the company to book immediately huge amount of revenues. At the same time though, the cash flow would only come years later. But this wasn't necessarily a problem if all the deals were of good quality. The consequence of this accounting practice was to create a relentless push to sign more and more contracts to show that the revenues were going up quarter after quarter, year after year. And it does not come to a surprise that at some point risky deals with very little chance of generating a positive cash flow were booked. Some of them were abandoned even before they started. Enron though had the habit of never declaring those deals as dead, therefore avoiding writing them off. Furthermore, to squeeze even more revenues out of projects, dealmakers regularly reviewed old contracts older than 5 years and revised upwards the original value. Note though that all this wasn't illegal, it was well within the accounting rules, even though the spirit of those rules was obviously thwarted. A similar behavior can be found in the international division. International deals were signed left and right, but actual revenues and cash flow were lacking. One of the reasons was that the deal makers were getting their bonuses when the project was signed and fully financed, not when it was delivered and started to make a positive return. Therefore, there was very little incentive to see the project through to actual completion. Accounting-wise though, the estimated revenues were banked in advance, of course. The same reasoning can be applied to the diversification strategy in other segments, where also the inexperience in those segments, plus the different nature of the product, played a central role in the failures to replicate the gas bank model. If mark-to-market accounting pushed towards aggressive revenue recognition practices, the use of SPEs and prepay contracts pushed towards the limits of accounting practices and even beyond. By mid-1990s, when substantially the gas bank was running out of steam and everyone was waiting for Skilling's next big idea, SPEs and prepays became the main vehicle for Enron to show ever-increasing revenues and secure the necessary cash flow the company was in dire need of. Enron, in fact, was a beast in perennial need of cash, and it's easy to understand why. Too many underperforming deals, unchecked corporate expenses, hefty salaries and bonuses paid to directors, executives, and high-performing employees, and of course, the huge amount of cash needed to expand and maintain the gas supplies and the power plants they were building all over the world. So one way to generate cash was through an asset-light strategy. With this, Enron was selling its assets to SPEs to free capital, but also to book those sales as recurring revenues. At some point, these transactions were mainly done at year-end just to achieve the financial figures that investors and creditors were expecting. This meant that an asset could be sold in November to an SPE, then bought back a few months later. Again, not illegal, but it should have raised concerns. In addition, Enron was also using its own stock as a guarantee to the lenders of the SPEs. Not to mention that these transactions all required the creation of multiple entities that borrowed from different lenders, all of which were relying on Enron's guarantees and shares to have their money paid back. This meant two things. First of all, those entities were not independent and should have been consolidated. Secondly, all the SPEs were using Enron's shares to finance Enron itself in a sort of perverse financial loop, or possibly a pyramid scheme. These SPEs were indeed useful for cash flow purposes, but their use mutated during year 2000, when they were mainly used to move accounting losses out of the company's income statement. With this, Enron went beyond the accounting principles. Aside the deals with the SPEs, the cash flow was primarily coming from prepay contracts. These contracts are a bit convoluted, but let's try to explain them as simply as possible. So we have three companies, A, B, and C, where Company B, it's important, was created and financed by Company C, specifically for this operation. Company A enters in agreement with Company B to deliver them a certain amount of gas at a certain price at a future date. At the same time, Company C agrees with Company A to deliver to A the same amount of gas at a different, possibly higher price. The final result is that there is no gas actually delivered, only payments. B pays A immediately, and then A pays C at a future date. This is nothing more and nothing less than a loan. This means that Company A should show a financing debt in its balance sheet. Enron, or Company A, managed though to book this operation as trade liability, allowing its debt position to look immaculate. Of course, Enron got addicted on this scheme and ended up using new prepays to pay for the old ones when they were due, but always hiding from the investors the ever-increasing debt. Worth noting is that Company C is usually an investment bank that can earn fat fees from this operation, and in fact banks recklessly fed Enron's addiction, earning millions of dollars from these schemes. Ultimately, banks were indeed enablers of Enron's shenanigans. The final layer in all this was the fraud perpetrated by Fasto, the CFO, and his associates. Fasto basically decided that his quite remunerative paycheck was not enough. He saw all the bonuses and benefits paid to the deal makers and decided that it was time to get his share. So he set up a company that invested in the SPEs he was setting up on Enron's behalf. He was also appointed as director of those SPEs, so he paid himself hundreds of thousands of dollars in salaries and unspecified consulting work. Not only that, He made also show that all those sell and buyback asset deals that Enron was making guaranteed a minimum return for the SPE he had personally invested in. And finally, through a series of complicated and outright fraudulent machinations, he managed to have Enron liquidate his and his associates' positions in the SPEs, cashing in tens of millions of dollars out of an initial total investment of just few hundreds of thousands of dollars. It seems clear that the combination of all these unchecked and, quite frankly, tolerated reckless and fraudulent behaviors accumulated over time till reached a critical mass and everything imploded in a tragic and at the same time spectacular way. One final aspect needs to be analyzed and it pertains to the following question. Has anyone ever really noticed anything? The final element of Enron's scandal was indeed the failure of Enron's internal controls and ethics to rein in the kind of behaviors and practices we outlined, but also the incapability of supposedly independent auditors and analysts to spot the early signs of problems. Let's have a look at the attitude of directors, external auditors, fund managers, and independent analysts. The board of directors substantially approved everything: the mark-to-market, the SPEs, prepays, the asset-light strategy, etc. Even the appointment of Faster as director of one of the SPE in what was a clear conflict of interest. From their point of view, as long as revenues were growing and investors were happy, they did not care much about the details of what was going on. The fact that they had a substantial amount of stock options in their pockets was an important factor, especially in the push for short-term growth and fuel an ever-increasing share price at any cost. Despite having an ethics code, all board members and directors showed in practice that they had very little morals and were happy to bend the rules or turn a blind eye as long as they could benefit. Arthur Andersen, Enron's external auditors, had a huge conflict of interest themselves. They earned fees certifying Enron's accounts and validating their accounting practices, but they were seemingly unable to say no to every creative accounting solution that Faster was coming up with. But that's because at the same time they earned even higher fees by consulting for them, helping in devising all the SPEs and prepaid structures that Faster was setting up. They simply did not want to upset such a valuable customer. On top of that, in some occasions they acted with incompetence too, setting up SPEs without respecting the 3% rule we talked about earlier, causing the restatements announced in November 2001. When Enron's problems started to emerge, Andersen personnel even tried to conceal the responsibilities by shredding documents and deleting emails, ultimately committing obstruction of justice. Fund managers, on their part, were partially victims of Enron's poor disclosures in their communications, but they were also somewhat guilty of following the crowd. Because they didn't want their fund to underperform versus the average, they held on to Enron's stock till it was too late. Basically, they were more concerned to follow each other's moves than looking closely at Enron's financial statements that indeed, it was demonstrated, could have shown some red flags. Similarly, analysts had very little incentives to closely investigate Enron's financials too. That's because on one side, if they published unfavorable analysis, they would be excluded from first-hand communication from Enron itself, and on the other side, they earned bonuses when their recommendations led to Enron stock being bought. And so there it is, the famous Enron scandal. A company that was once called the Wall Street Darling. It was nothing more than sublimated greed, self-entitlement, personal ambition, and lack of morals. And what happened to the main characters of this tragedy? Lay was convicted of security and wire fraud. He died of heart attack in 2006 before sentencing. Skilling was convicted of securities and wire fraud, conspiracy, insider trading, false statements to auditors. He was sentenced to 24 years in prison in 2006. Later, the sentence was reduced and he was released in 2019. Faster was convicted of securities and wire fraud, sentenced in 2004 to serve 10 years in prison. He was released in 2011. Arthur Andersen was found complicit in Enron's fraudulent activity and it led to the breakup of the company. Finally, Enron's big legacy was the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, whose intent was to restore public confidence in the corporate financial statements and avoid another debacle of the same proportions. Can another Enron happen nowadays? Probably not in the way it unfolded back then. But greed, self-entitlement, personal ambition, etc. are part of our society. And as long as they are present, there will always be smart people trying to game the system to achieve their goals one way or another. Thank you for watching. If you like the video, please leave a comment, like and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you.